April 15th, 1982. You know, folks, after you've been sitting behind this desk for enough years, you start thinking you've seen just about everything television can throw at you. A comedian forgets the punchline, a movie star arrives late, an animal decides it likes the audience more than the trainer. Believe me, after a while, nothing surprises you anymore. Or at least, that's what I believed. That Thursday night started exactly the way hundreds of Tonight shows had started before it. The audience was in terrific spirits. Ed McMahon had already warmed everybody up. Doc and the band sounded wonderful. And backstage, there was that familiar excitement that always comes with having an old friend as your guest. Ladies and gentlemen, when you invite Tony Curtis onto your show, you don't need much of a plan. You simply ask one question, sit back, and enjoy the ride. Tony had enough stories to keep television running for a week. The man had worked alongside legends, survived Hollywood's wildest years, and somehow managed to come away smiling through all of it. When he walked out to his chair that evening, the audience greeted him like family. He looked relaxed. He looked confident. He looked exactly like Tony Curtis. We shook hands, exchanged a few jokes, and before long, he was doing what he always did best, telling stories that only someone who had actually lived through Hollywood's golden age could tell. One minute he was talking about filming with Marilyn Monroe. The next he had everybody laughing about working with Jack Lemmon. Then somehow we ended up discussing Billy Wilder, and Tony could imitate almost anybody he'd ever met. Every impression was funnier than the last. Now that's one of the pleasures of interviewing someone you've known for years. You don't feel like you're conducting an interview. You feel like you're sitting in the living room with an old friend while millions of people happen to be listening. The audience couldn't get enough of him. Every punchline landed. Every story drew another round of applause. Even Ed was laughing so hard I thought we might have to replace him before the next commercial. Everything about the evening felt effortless. If someone had told me during those first several minutes that the show would soon become the most frightening experience of my career, I would have laughed them right out of Studio One, because nothing, not one single thing, suggested anything was wrong. Tony looked energetic. His voice was strong. His timing was perfect. He leaned forward as he described another behind-the-scenes story, moving his hands the way he always did whenever he became excited. Then something happened. Not all at once, just enough to make me pay attention. When you've spent decades interviewing thousands of people, you begin noticing tiny things most viewers never see. A hesitation, a change in someone's breathing, a smile that disappears a little too quickly. Tony paused in the middle of a sentence. It wasn't one of those dramatic pauses performers use before delivering the punchline. This one felt different. He stopped talking. His eyes drifted downward for just a second. The color in his face changed so subtly that I doubt anyone watching at home noticed it. But from only a few feet away, I did. At first, I wondered whether he'd simply forgotten where the story was going. That happens. It happens to all of us. Then I noticed he wasn't looking at me anymore. He wasn't looking at the audience either. He seemed to be concentrating on something only he could feel. I leaned forward just a little. "Tony?" He didn't answer, not immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, then another. His hand moved toward the center of his chest. Now people in the audience still thought they were watching another funny story unfold. A few even chuckled, expecting some unexpected punchline. After all, Tony Curtis knew how to build suspense, but this wasn't comedy. I could see that now. His expression had changed completely. Gone was the easy smile. Gone was the sparkle that had filled the studio only moments before. In its place was confusion and something else. Fear. The kind of fear a person can't hide, no matter how hard they try. I spoke again. "Tony, are you all right?" This time he looked toward me. His lips moved. The words barely came out. "Johnny." Then he stopped. He swallowed hard, almost as though speaking itself had suddenly become difficult. The studio had become so quiet you could probably hear a camera motor turning somewhere across the room. 20 million people were watching, yet somehow the room had never felt smaller. Tony blinked once, his shoulders slumped. One hand gripped the armrest of the chair, the other remained pressed against his chest. He tried to straighten himself. He tried to keep talking. He even managed the beginning of another sentence. "I don't..." Those were the last words he managed before his body suddenly went limp. For just the briefest instant, the entire studio froze, not because anyone wanted to, but because when something completely unexpected happens, your mind needs a heartbeat to catch up with your eyes. One moment, Tony Curtis had been sitting across from me, trying to finish a sentence. The next, he was slumped forward in his chair, completely unresponsive. The audience didn't clap. Nobody laughed. There wasn't a sound anywhere in the building. You could almost feel 20 million people at home holding their breath at exactly the same time. Now, when you're doing live television, you're trained to expect the unexpected. Microphones fail, cameras malfunction, guests forget what they were going to say, but nothing prepares you for watching a friend suddenly collapse right in front of you. There wasn't time to wonder what had happened. There wasn't time to hope someone else would take charge. There was only time to act. I pushed my chair back and was at Tony's side almost immediately. "Tony!" I called, keeping my voice as calm as I possibly could. "Can you hear me?" There was no answer. His breathing looked shallow, and his head had fallen forward. I turned toward the audience. "Is there a doctor here?" The words echoed through the silent studio. Before anyone could respond, members of the production crew were already moving from every direction. Someone headed backstage. Someone else reached for the nearest telephone. The floor manager was already signaling for help. Everything seemed to happen at once, yet somehow the room remained strangely quiet. I carefully supported Tony so he wouldn't slide from the chair awkwardly. The last thing anyone wanted was for him to be injured further while we waited for medical assistance. Ed McMahon was beside us almost instantly. The smile that audiences knew so well had disappeared from his face. He looked at Tony, then at me. "What do you need?" "Help me give him some room," I answered. Together we made sure there was space around him while the crew continued calling for emergency medical assistance. No one shouted, no one panicked. Every person in that studio understood that staying calm was the most helpful thing they could do. I kept speaking to Tony. "Stay with us." No response. "Tony, can you hear me?" Still nothing. His eyes remained only partially open. His breathing continued, but it seemed strained. The audience now understood this wasn't part of the program. Some people folded their hands together. Others quietly wiped tears from their eyes. No one wanted to interrupt. No one wanted to make things more difficult. They simply watched, hoping their beloved movie star would open his eyes. I remember glancing toward the cameras. Millions of viewers were still connected to that moment. People sitting in living rooms all across America had suddenly become witnesses to something no producer could have planned. I knew they deserved honesty. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said as calmly as I could, "we're dealing with a medical emergency. Help is on the way, and we're going to do everything we can for Tony." Those weren't dramatic words. They were simply the truth. Sometimes the truth is all people need to hear. Behind the scenes, Fred de Cordova was already making decisions only an experienced television director could make. Within moments, the show prepared to step away while emergency personnel continued toward the stage. Even then, nobody was thinking about ratings. Nobody was thinking about tomorrow's headlines. The only thing that mattered was Tony Curtis. Time has a strange way of changing during moments like that. A single minute can feel like an hour. Every second seems longer than the one before it. Eventually, the sound everyone had been waiting for finally reached the studio. Medical personnel arrived quickly and immediately took over. Their movements were confident and practiced. They asked questions, checked Tony's condition, prepared equipment. The studio remained silent as everyone stepped back to give them room to work. Watching professionals do what they are trained to do reminds you how important preparation really is. Within moments, they carefully lifted Tony onto a stretcher. As they wheeled him toward the exit, I walked alongside for a few steps. I looked down at my friend. "You're going to be all right," I said quietly. Whether he heard those words, I couldn't possibly know. But sometimes you say them because they're what a friend needs to hear, even if only your own heart hears them. The doors closed behind the medical team. Suddenly the stage felt enormous. Just minutes earlier, it had been filled with laughter, old Hollywood stories, and applause. Now it was completely still. The audience remained seated. No one rushed for the exits. No one complained that the show had stopped. Instead, they applauded, not for entertainment, but out of hope. Hope that Tony Curtis would recover. Hope that the next time those curtains opened, he'd be smiling again. Backstage, everyone waited for news. Crew members who had worked hundreds of broadcasts suddenly found themselves speaking in whispers. People checked telephones. Producers contacted the hospital. Every update mattered. Finally, word arrived that Tony had reached the medical center and was receiving immediate treatment. No diagnosis had been confirmed yet, but at least he was in the right place, surrounded by the people best equipped to help him. Only then did everyone in the studio allow themselves to take a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Sometimes television reminds us that beneath the lights, the cameras, and the applause, we're all simply human beings looking out for one another. And on that unforgettable night, nothing mattered more than hoping an old friend would soon find his way back home. 3 weeks passed before I saw Tony Curtis again. Those felt like very long weeks. Every few days, someone from the show would ask whether there had been another update from the hospital, whether Tony was feeling stronger, whether he might be ready to return. Around the studio, people weren't talking about his next movie anymore. They were talking about their friend. Then finally came the news everyone had been hoping for. Tony wanted to come back to The Tonight Show, not to promote a film, not to tell another Hollywood story, simply to say thank you. The moment his name was announced, the audience rose to its feet before he even walked through the curtain. The applause started immediately. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't celebrity applause. It was the kind of welcome you give someone you're genuinely happy to see standing again. Tony walked onto the stage a little slower than usual, but he was smiling. The smile alone brought another wave of applause. When we met in the center of the stage, neither of us said anything for a moment. Sometimes words aren't the first thing friends need. We simply embraced. When we finally sat down, Tony looked out at the audience, smiled, and shook his head. "You know, Johnny," he began, "I've spent years making action pictures. I've fought gladiators, escaped impossible situations, and survived all kinds of things on movie screens." The audience laughed softly. "But nothing I've ever filmed compared to what happened right here." The room became quiet again. "I woke up in the hospital," Tony continued, "and the first thing the doctors told me was that I had collapsed during our interview." He paused for a moment. "I couldn't believe it." I smiled. "I'll admit," I said, "I would have preferred if you'd waited until after the commercial." That drew the first genuine laugh of the evening. Even Tony laughed. "You always know how to break the tension," he replied. "But honestly, it scared me." He looked around the audience before continuing. "The doctors explained everything that happened after I lost consciousness." He turned toward me. "They told me everyone stayed calm. They told me help arrived quickly. And they told me you never left my side." I simply shrugged. "That's what friends do." Tony smiled. "No," he answered quietly. "That's what real friends do." The audience applauded again. Then Tony shared something many viewers hadn't known. He explained that recovering from the medical emergency had given him a completely different perspective on life. "Sometimes," he said, "you become so busy making plans for tomorrow that you forget how valuable today really is." He admitted the experience had changed him. He wanted to spend more time with family. He wanted to take better care of himself. He wanted to appreciate the people who had stood beside him when he couldn't stand on his own. Listening to him, it was clear this wasn't the same conversation we'd expected to have only a few weeks earlier. Originally, we'd planned to laugh about old Hollywood stories. Instead, we found ourselves talking about gratitude, about second chances, about how quickly life can surprise you. I asked Tony what he remembered from that night. He smiled thoughtfully. "Very little. I remember feeling different. I remember trying to finish my sentence. And then," he snapped his fingers, "nothing. The next thing I knew, I was opening my eyes in a hospital room." He laughed softly. "I've missed interviews before, but that's the first one I've ever slept through." The audience burst into laughter. There it was, Tony Curtis, finding humor again. And somehow that laughter sounded even better than usual. As the interview continued, Tony thanked the doctors, nurses, emergency responders, and everyone who had helped him through his recovery. He spoke warmly about the letters he'd received from viewers across the country. Thousands of strangers had written to wish him well. Some shared stories of their own health struggles. Others simply wanted him to know they had been praying for him. Tony admitted those messages meant more than people could possibly imagine. "It's funny," he said. "You spend years entertaining people you never meet. And then one day those same people remind you you're not facing life's hardest moments by yourself." That thought stayed with everyone in the studio. Before the interview ended, I looked over at Tony one more time. "I've got just one request." "What's that?" he asked. "The next time you come on the show." He raised an eyebrow. "Let's make the biggest surprise of the evening one of your stories." The audience erupted. Tony laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. "Deal," he said. I think we've both had enough excitement for one lifetime. As the credits rolled that evening, the applause seemed louder than ever. Not because anyone had delivered the perfect joke, not because a movie had been promoted, but because everyone watching had witnessed something television rarely captures. Two lifelong friends, one grateful to still be alive, the other grateful he'd been there when he was needed most. Long after that night, people continued talking about the moment. Many said it reminded them how quickly ordinary days can become extraordinary. Others said it encouraged them to learn basic emergency response skills and to be better prepared if someone around them ever needed help. For Tony Curtis, the experience became a turning point. He embraced healthier habits, focused more on the people he loved, and often spoke about appreciating every new day he was given. Years later, he would still describe that evening as one of the most life-changing moments he had ever experienced. And whenever anyone asked me about the most unforgettable night of The Tonight Show, my answer was never about the biggest celebrity or the funniest joke. It was about the night laughter stopped for a little while so friendship could take center stage. Because television may bring people together for entertainment, but every once in a while, it reminds us what really matters. And on that unforgettable evening, the brightest spotlight in Studio One wasn't shining on Hollywood. It was shining on compassion, friendship, and the simple determination to stand beside someone when they need you most. Sometimes that's the greatest performance anyone can ever give.